Gary Lachman has been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a founding member of Blondie. For a long time now, he's written on the history of the esoteric and the occult. His prolific output includes Turn Off Your Mind, The Mystic 60s and the Dark Side of the Age of Aquarius, A Secret History of Consciousness, Jung the Mystic, Aleister Crowley, Magic, Rock and Roll, and the Wickedest Man in the World, and the brand new The Secret Teachers of the Western World. I've read 2.5 of those, and I'm a fan. Mr. Lachman is a bona fide expert on these topics, and I hope we can at least scratch the surface today of what he knows about consciousness, lesser-known schools within Western philosophy, and, of course, rock and roll. Gary Lachman, thank you for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure, Grant. Thank you for having me on.
Let's talk about, well, what we're doing right now. We're Skyping New York to London. Let's talk about the internet age and what it's doing to consciousness. In your new book, you say that it is miraculous that we have instant access to teachings that people have spent years and crossed continents on foot to find before in earlier periods, and that nothing is really esoteric anymore in the sense of inaccessible. Yet you've also warned in A Secret History of Consciousness about the effect of this information glut, the simultaneity of past and present, and what that does to our appreciation for the material at hand and for history. What is the information age and the internet as a technology doing to our consciousness?
Yes, you're right. I mean, as you say in the Secret Teachers of the Western World, my latest book, I do talk about how in our contemporary time, one of the differences about studying the esoteric or just being interested in this sort of stuff and exploring it is that so much material that at one time was very difficult of access is just available on the internet. And as you say, this is part of the general kind of information overload or information glut that's out there. And as with so many things, which is a kind of truism, but there's a reason it is that there's two sides about these things. So the availability is one thing that I think is it's just there, it's just evident, but it's not always a blessing. Let's put it that way, because the availability is something, and the widespread sort of interpretation and repetition and general kind of dissemination or unregulated dissemination, let's say, that is part of the internet, means that many, many, many more people have access to this kind of thing, but it also requires a great deal of discrimination now, I think, to cut through a lot of the noise to get to the actual signal. And this is a point that I did bring up in the earlier book, which incidentally also has the word secret in the title, The Secret History of Consciousness, is that there have been quite a few people talking about the internet itself as some evidence of or trigger for a sudden shift and change in consciousness. And I'm not too sure about that, but I think in a certain sense it certainly is evidence for this kind of new availability of things. But that in itself can also erode and sort of dissolve some of the importance of things if something is too available, it's too widespread. And it doesn't, what was once esoteric in the sense of being difficult of access, let's say. I mean, esoteric means inner, basically. Just like exoteric is the outer surface of something. But it also, because of this quality of being inner, it tends to have less, let's say, less people interested in, less people, following it, let's say, than the exoteric element, say, in the church. The exoteric church has more members than the inner church does. And what at one time was something available to the few is now available out there to the many, and it's not secret anymore. It's no longer inner; it's just there. I mean, all you need to do is, just put in esoteric or esotericism or hermeticism or any combination of these terms into your search engine, and you'll find hundreds, thousands of hits of different things. So it's a double-edged sword, to use a cliche. The availability is there. If you many things that you used to have to hunt down in libraries, can be yours at the flick of a switch now, or the tap of a mouse or whatever. But at the same time, there's a lot of rubbish out there too.
There is. It's easy to have, probably especially for someone my age and younger who has grown up with the internet as a utility, like having a water faucet. There's the illusion of knowing something. So you're curious about something, you Google it, and you read literally 100 words about it, and you go away feeling that you know it. But that is, of course, just a pretty cursory way of interfacing with something. For example, I have been curious about Aleister Crowley, and it was actually by reading your bio of him that I became aware of you. It's a disillusioning read for somebody who romanticizes him, which I've never really done, but I just find him interesting. But anyway, there's such an immense difference. I used to think that you could basically learn everything you needed to know by reading about it, and this left-brainedness towards things. And then I became aware of an OTO Gnostic Mass that was the one that he scripted and he designed. And I went to one with my fiance, and the experience of embodying and processing through this occult Mass, just even once, taught me far more about him than I would have learned by Googling him. But if you had asked me before I did that Mass, I could have, recited things about him. So there's certainly a deeper way of knowing things that we can deprive ourselves of.
Oh, that's certainly true. But this is going, in many ways, that argument goes as far back as Plato. Plato was concerned about the rise of writing, because he thought that was going to lead to the deterioration of memory and so on. But you're absolutely right. There's the sense of a kind of sense of a false reality of things, or a false experience of things. That we see everything mediated, through a screen. You're absolutely right. And of course, there's a great deal of difference between reading about having sex and having sex. There's a great deal of difference about reading about Paris and actually going there. You're absolutely right. And the Gnostic Mass that you talk about, I participated in one, but many years ago. And it was an experience for me. But at the same time, I think this is the thing. I think we need both. We need both. You do need the other, what you were calling left-brained sort of knowledge. It's the difference that they talk about in.
Yes, let's get into this
between episteme and gnosis.
This is the really the central thesis of your new book, that there is a left and a right brain rivalry. You said, quote, "We have a milieu regarding the internet in which works are seen as mere triggers for instant analysis," and that's the way the left brain, experiences things. More linguistic, more of a sense of measurements and breaking things into discrete, analyzable elements, a sense of a timeline, and then, well, take it from here. How would you describe the right brain's way of experiencing things?
Well, right brain is more participatory. It's more holistic. It's more about a whole, but it's less explicit than the left brain. It's more vague, fuzzy. Was the hip word a while ago. The thing you with the right brain, you have a sense of the whole, but it seems to be informed with what in the book I say are implicit sorts of meanings, which has a lot to do with music. And I should point out that the idea of this rivalry between the two sides of the brain comes from a fantastic book called The Master and His Emissary, which is by E. McGilchrist, who is both a neuroscientist and an English scholar. And so he has, as it were, both one foot in each side, with the sort of traditional cliched idea of the left being the scientist and the right being the artist or the poet, and that sort of thing. So you could say the left deals in sort of explicit, discrete, easily analyzable and systematized facts. It's interested in breaking things down into the parts and seeing how they work and reproducing that kind of schematic of things on its experience, because it's the brain that we use in order to deal with the world. And in one sense, it doesn't really matter if it turns out that it's not exactly either side of the brain, because a lot has been talked about that and that kind of thing. I think, what is undeniable is that there are these two sorts of modes of consciousness, and that we can see. In one sense, there's one that you deal with the world, you have to maneuver through it, you have to find your way through it, and in this way we have to sort of break it down into easily recognizable parts, into symbols in a way. You turn the rich immediate reality that's more the province of the right brain into a kind of dehydrated symbol, but that's in order to deal with the world quickly and effectively. Now, we're very good at that. That's why we're the dominant species on the planet. But it's led to a kind of imbalance where this other mode, which is earlier one, an older form of consciousness, where it's a kind of immediate participatory relationship with this whole that we experience in its full kind of complexity and richness, and we have moments of that. Listening to music is something like that. Enjoying poetry, we enjoy alcohol and other inebriants in order to, for a brief time, put the workaholic kind of left brain to sleep, so that this more appreciative kind of mode of consciousness comes in. And what struck me when I read this book, Master and His Emissary, a few years back, is that the way McGilchrist was describing the right brain's approach or interaction with experience in the world, having to do with simultaneity, having to do with a kind of atemporal sense. It's not too fussed about time, a connectedness, idea of relationship between things. And again, this kind of implicit meaning, the kind of meaning that you know is there, but you can't put your finger on exactly. When you listen to a great piece of music that moves you deeply, you can't say what it was about in the same way that you can say what a sentence means, or you can point to some sort of mathematical equation, that sort of thing. And I think it struck me that a lot of, or much, or the whole fundamental sort of way of seeing the world that's associated with the esoteric or the hermetic or the magical, the occult, is very much like that. And if there was this kind of rivalry going on that McGilchrist writes about, and others have written about it too. There's another book called The Alphabet versus the Goddess by a fellow named Leonard Shlain, died some years ago, where he argues that the rise of the alphabet, of literacy, which he associates with the left brain, basically undermined or subjugated this earlier image-based, more feminine right brain culture. And so there was another kind of rivalry or kind of battle or competition going on. And I thought, well, if this is really going on, and you can even see it in incidences of people who have had brain surgery in order to stop epilepsy, where they cut the connection between the two sides of the brain. And what happens is they actually wind up turning into two different people. I mean, I write about that in the beginning of the book. But any case, if there is this rivalry going on, what kind of forms would it take? So Shlain talks about it in terms of the alphabet, literacy gaining precedence over image base. But it also struck me that the whole rejection of this esoteric, hermetic, occult, magical point of view, or a body of knowledge, which was available and which many prestigious people throughout history pursued. There was this kind of all-out attack on it in the early 1600s, associated with the rise of science, which is Western science is the sort of left brain mode of expression par excellence.
which is continues in figures like Richard Dawkins today.
Oh yeah. I mean, absolutely.
And the thing with someone like Dawkins is it's not that he's wrong, but it's that he is willingly blind to the entire right brain experience.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I also would say that there are people on the other side, that are sort of very enthusiastic kind of occultists or anti-science people, put it that way. Who don't want to see. I'm trying to walk this kind of tightrope between the two myself.
Within the social milieu of people who are dedicated to learning about the occult and the esoteric, I mean, you must be a square, right? Because it of course can be, just go off into the realm of non-falsifiability or just total subjectivity, total poetry, you might say.
Yeah, I mean, again, and there's good poets and bad poets too. I mean, just as I said, there's a lot of rubbish. I mean, what I'm interested in, essentially, my interest in this started many, many years ago when I was, I was playing in Blondie. In 1975. I'd always been a reader. I'd read a lot of poetry. I read a lot of, philosophy and existentialists and Nietzsche. I was reading a lot of that, and that was sort of my kind of center of gravity. And then just where I was living on the Bowery, about a block away from CBGB with Chris Stein and Debbie Harry, somebody else living in this loft, this wild flamboyant artist, was into Crowley and was into magic. And Chris and Debbie had some interest in that kind of stuff too. It was sort of there, it was around. And I hadn't had any interest in the occult before then. I liked horror films and magic. I thought of H.P. Lovecraft and stuff like that, but I didn't take any of it seriously. But then I started reading this, and for some reason or other, I got interested in it. And a book that really affected me at the time was a book called The Occult by Colin Wilson, who's a British writer who wrote many, 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 many books. I'm actually working on a book about him now. And in any case, so from the kind of enthusiastic, fun kind of introduction to this sort of thing, I gradually became aware of it as a larger, what do you want to call it, kind of cultural form. It was something that's just there. If you start to look into it and you take the history of it seriously, it is as much a part of Western culture as art forms are, or literature and science and so on. And I gradually became more and more interested in ideas about consciousness itself, rather than specifically occult or specifically. I'll put it this way: the occult and paranormal and the esoteric became for me ways of understanding aspects of consciousness that the mainstream tradition ignored, didn't look at, but I found to be real. They just were real to me, and it was obvious to me that they, was something that was true. And this is a way to sort of understand it. And then that gradually became what I'm doing now, is trying to understand the history, looking at the history of consciousness through the lens of this esoteric tradition, and also backwards the other way around, looking at the esoteric tradition in terms of ideas about the evolution of consciousness, which is what I do in the new book, The Secret Teachers of the Western World, because I try to understand this rejection of this Hermetic tradition in terms of both this rivalry between the two sides of the brain, and also in terms of the ideas of a little-known German-Swiss philosopher named Gebser, who died in the early 1970s. But he wrote an enormous book called The Ever-Present Origin, and briefly put, he argued that consciousness goes through what he calls these different structures, and these structures change over time. There are different sort of mutations of consciousness, and the one we are in now, which he calls the mental rational. Actually, we're experiencing the breakdown of the mental rational structure. The way he describes that is very much the way McGilchrist describes our increasingly left-brain dominant sort of world. The problem McGilchrist says today is that the left brain has become too dominant in the last couple of centuries since the Industrial Revolution. And what it's been doing is been recreating the world outside it in terms of its own ideas, its own preferences. So it's basically turning the world outside into a machine, because that's what the left brain works best with, something that's reproducible and mechanical. And this leaves less and less of a kind of untouched world for the right brain to kind of presence, as McGilchrist says.
That stops me in my tracks when I read that. That was a fascinating idea. And then the right brain has less. It's less necessary, has less of a role in today's world, which is true. I mean, all the things that the right brain excels at are things that we sort of make time for and contrive reasons to use. Whatever, a walk in the park, anything done for its own sake.
Yeah. Well, but it's also we think, okay, it's good for my health to do that.
Exactly.
It has a purpose of. It is, of course. But
it was freaking me out.
It has a beauty.
I went on
and a meaning in itself. Well, this is the thing. I mean, if once you recognize that and you see this, I understand exactly what you mean. And it's up to people like us who recognize this to somehow, at least drag your heels. But I think what we need to do is come up with a more productive, response than, But I know exactly how you feel. Yeah.
Well, to illustrate it, this is while I'm wrapping up Secret Teachers of the Western World over the holidays. I went for a hike with my parents in Coachella Valley, and we're going up this hill, and there just kept being these little impositions of the left mind on something that didn't need it at all. So first of all, my dad wanted to take out the map to check the map for how many miles we had gone to determine whether to turn around, when all we needed to do is just, sense the tiredness of our own body. And then afterwards, people were saying, "Oh, I wish we had an app so we knew how many steps we had taken." And then and then again, looking at the map at the trailhead, oh, what was the name of the path that we went on?
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, and the thing is, I mean, it's a habit we've developed. I mean, we're not evil for doing this, but it's a habit. It's a habit we develop, and again, it's how should we say it? It's something that works well. That's working too well, and it's working too much. I mean, we do need this. We do need this utilitarian dealing with mode, and we're very good at it. But as you say, it's something that we do too much now. It's gone into overdrive. I mean, this is the thing. I mean, you're clearly much younger than I am, and you've grown, as you said, you've grown up with the internet like tap, water being on tap. Or it's part of nature in that sense. I mean, for me, I grew up. Television was there. Television was nature in the sense of the world that's there as I become aware of it. But it was something that my parents experienced coming into the world. I've experienced, people with their smartphones and all that coming into the world. And everyone always looks up everything now. I mean, it used to be, whatever, when I go home and look it up, if it's still interesting to me. But now everyone has to get to the fact, and they have to get it. And it's just, I just find it, I mean, it certainly dates me, to say this kind of thing. But I just find it so strange that, people have to get that kind of, it's usually trivia. It's some question about a movie or an actor or something like that. It isn't like, some, information you actually need. The fact that you can find the exact fact now on demand, facts on tap, is what it is. And it's strange.
That style of thought of saying to oneself, I'll look it up later. The most disciplined people seem to master themselves in that way. That brought to mind the way that, Elliott Smith worked, at least in the period after he moved to New York, is he'd spend a lot of time drinking in a bar, and he would write lyrics because he wouldn't be able to remember them perfectly if he didn't write them down, so that's more kind of left brain. But he would also think of melodies, and he didn't have a recording device, even though he could have. He said, if I can't remember the melody later, it just wasn't good enough. And he trusted that this, even the idea of letting oneself forget something is it's not standard issue right now.
No, I know you're absolutely right. I mean, again, this is one of the things that McGilchrist brings out very, very clearly in his book, where again there's there's sort of less and less of a kind of untouched, and not it doesn't necessarily mean out in the rainforest or up in the tundra, although he himself lives up in the Isle of Skye, far away from civilization, in the northern tip of Great Britain. But as you say, even the sorts of things that one would just do because they were pleasant to do have become kind of part of this regime. This kind of purpose of everything having some. And there's a wonderful phrase by another this literary philosopher and cultural mandarin, George Steiner. He talks about the sovereignly useless, which I just think is wonderful. And again, you can see. I mean, he's recognized this from the context of academia and the humanities and all that, and the whole idea of the study of literature, art, music, and because they are good ends in themselves, and their importance has dwindled over the years, and everything is becoming more and more. The value of something is being gauged by whether it can be presented and approached in the way we're just talking about. But it's kind of utilitarian, sort of, or the explained. Things have to be explained. That's one of the pet peeves of my earlier book, Secret History of Consciousness. This whole idea of consciousness explained. There was the famous book by Daniel Dennett in the 90s, and there were a few other versions, different philosophers wanting to kind of pin it down. And I mean, basically, this is this whole left brain.
The word "it" is a metaphor that places consciousness outside of us and is, pin it down. So you're conceptually altering what consciousness is.
And also, I mean, when you say there isn't this consciousness per se, it is your consciousness and my. So to explain consciousness means you're explaining me, or explaining you, and you'll have to forgive me if I don't quite feel comfortable with your explanations of me. But no, it seems this kind of manic need to have this explicitness about about some things that seem to have an aura of. And again, I'm not just arguing for the old romantic notion of let's not understand everything because it'll make it disenchanted. It'll take the life out of it. No, I think there are some things that, as I said before, they have this implicit kind of meaning that you can't word. This is why we have poetry and music and art. They can convey these kind of meanings, but these meanings aren't explicit in the way that scientific meanings are. Or there's a difference between poetry and prose.
There's a complementary balance in the long march of history covered in Secret Teachers of the Western World. You identify Greek antiquity, the Renaissance, and the Romantic era as being times when that was in balance in the West culturally, and inevitably these were some of the most fruitful bursts of cultural and scientific and artistic achievement.
Well, that does seem to be the case, that when these two opponents work together, however briefly, they seem to produce work of exceptional quality. I mean, William Blake, wonderful poet and mystic and visionary, intuited this sort of thing when he said, opposition is true friendship. And he also said, without contraries, there is no progression. So one of the differences between the kind of notion of the relationship between these two modes of consciousness that I try to express in the book and, say, some more generic kind of mystical ones, is the idea isn't to, somehow meld them together into a kind of oneness where everything's fine and lovely and harmony. It's to have the creative, the tension between them be creative. And again, this is how Gilchrist says the two brains work with each other. They kind of inhibit each other's excesses. So one's the brake on the other, at certain, and that relationship changes in different contexts and all that. So there's times in which, let's say, a left brain excess can be mitigated or kind of compensated for by something the right brain does, and vice versa. And things seem to work best when these two rivals, get into a relationship where their sort of tension between the two is very productive. There's a term from Jung that I use throughout the book called the Transcendent Function. And this was something Jung recognized when he was working with his patients, was that there came a time when the tension between their sort of conscious attitude toward their problem, their situation, and this unconscious need to change, this pressure coming from within them that led them to see him in the first place. It goes through a terrible kind of period of real tension and frustration, and then it can suddenly kind of, and to use a cliche, in a kind of quantum leap into the next shell of their personality. They suddenly rise above the situation. And it's not as if they solve the problem, but it's no longer seen as a problem. Somehow their personality has gone up a step or two, and it's matured beyond the situation being a problem. And so something like that, you can see working between the two sides of the brain, on these two modes of consciousness. And again, I quote from a poem by W.B. Yeats called Under Ben Bulben, where he talks about completing the partial mind. Again, there's this intuitive recognition of this duality or polarity, let's say. And again, that's the point I make in the beginning of the book. I mean, to point this out seems the height of banality, because we all know about yin and yang, we all know about the Tao, we all know about male and female and sun and moon and so on and so on. But again, yeah, it's true. But well, what is that? Why is that? Why do we all know about that? What really is going on there? And it does seem to me that this is something that we intuitively have grasped.
There's something valuable in the fact that you place this entirely within the Western tradition. Historically, there's yin and yang. These ideas have come from outside of the West, but of course the people with right hemispheres have been active in the West.
Mm-hmm.
Just as
No. I mean, you're right. I mean, I guess you could say on a global scale, the West is more left and the East is more right. But I guess in recent times that's probably changing to some degree, with cultural influences from either side and informing, either side. But well, that's one of the things for myself. When I first became interested in all this sort of stuff back in the sort of late 70s. And even earlier than that, I mean, I read a lot of D.T. Suzuki and Zen and books on Buddhism and Hinduism, and I got a great deal of value from that. But I guess somehow I just always felt there's something. I've always been more interested in the West's approach, even in sort of mainstream philosophy, and that's something else I try to do in my books, is make the connections between that and more esoteric or hermetic points of view. So in this book, I talk quite a bit about Henri Bergson and other philosophers in different places and so on. Some other books, Whitehead, William James, Nietzsche, and people like that. So I think, a great many of the, I think probably the difference in the West is that maybe in the East you can say there's a kind of notion of wanting to get away from the self and back into the, the whole, or the Godhead, or the all in some way. And I think in the West it's somehow exploring the self, trying to understand the self's, I hate this term journey and all that, but the self's progress, its growth, its development. What in German culture they call Bildung. This is kind of the cultivation. And that to me is a progress, is a growth of consciousness.
Yeah, Lewis Mumford in The Conduct of Life wrote about the need, or sort of psychological and social need for drama, and until that point I had considered drama a bad thing, but he wrote about the necessity that maybe is more of a Western thing, of a sense of where things are, where they're going, and what the stakes are, even if it is a bit of a psychological projection upon things.
Well, I think that that suggests that as overgeneralized as it is, the idea that the West is more left seems to make sense, because there is this kind of linearity in that sense. I mean, you can even see it in the music. The sonata allegro form. You have theme variation, and then the theme starts out, then it opens up, and then it changes, and then it hits resistance and problems, and then it comes back together, and it's home again. And so you have the kind of Odyssey kind of journey, journey and return. And also the development of science. I mean, it just is the case. Science in the way that we know it and have used it, and increasingly, placed all our eggs in its basket for the last 300 years is something developed in the West. I mean, it didn't at a particular time in the West too. I mean, it just didn't develop in the other half of that world. Not to say there was no indication or any way whatsoever of it, but it didn't, become that. So, I mean, there's something about that. I think there was a kind of search for. I think that the Faust, Goethe's Faust, is, there's a reason why it's one of the key works in Western canon, because it is about identity. It's about who am I, and this is what Western man wants to know. We have some very, to me, rather kind of inadequate answers to that question now. Most of them offered by science, or some kind of scientific sociology or something like that. And this is one of the things that attracted me to this Hermetic tradition, is that it seemed to have more interesting answers to that question.
Could you tell us more about Colin Wilson? Let's return to him. Him, along with John Gebser, I identified as being huge figures to you. I don't know. Colin Wilson may become a friend of yours. I know that he wrote a foreword to one of your books.
Yeah. Well,
you're writing a book about him, but
yeah.
All I know is, off the top of my head, is he took a more existential approach to the occult.
Well, he became famous as a young man in 1956 with his first book, The Outsider. It was published when he was 24. And it was a study of sort of alienation in modern consciousness, in the modern world. And it basically looked at these very extreme sorts of figures like Nietzsche and Dostoevsky, and also people like T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, and the dancer Nijinsky, and people like Sartre and Camus and others, all basically confronting this kind of question of identity. And it's fundamentally a kind of return to religious kind of questions, spiritual questions, to saying that how the humanistic, scientific, rationalistic ideas about man and humans, the world, were inadequate for these individuals who asked these kind of questions about their purpose. They had a deep hunger and a need for a sense of purpose and meaning that the kind of humanistic, rationalistic, scientific view of the world just could not provide. And Wilson was himself obsessed with these kind of questions. And his first book was an overnight, success. He was considered Britain's homegrown existentialist. But then the critics turned against him pretty quickly. He got caught up in this kind of media craze they called the Angry Young Men, which was sort of the equivalent of in the UK to the Beat generation, although they were more buttoned down, not quite as wild as the Beats. But they were a group of writers who were all very young and all came from working class backgrounds, and basically were writing these books that were in some way sort of saying that the system is all wrong and all that. And he got associated with them, and there was a huge media hype about them, and then the public got sick of them, and so the critics started going against him. But in any case, he continued to write, and he wrote this whole series of books developing his own kind of existentialism, and fundamentally about consciousness, about ways in which one could learn how to more or less trigger these kinds of experiences of intensity that he called sort of affirmation consciousness. And you get them in Nietzsche, and you get them in Blake, and he drew a lot of his he was influenced a great deal by an American psychologist named Abraham Maslow, who was one of the fathers of humanistic psychology that was very, very big in the 60s and 70s. And he developed this notion of what he called peak experiences. how some individuals were prone to having these kind of sudden, intense, states of kind of intense consciousness. And so Wilson devoted his life to basically trying to understand the phenomenology of that, applying existential analysis to more or less kind of mystical sorts of experiences. And then in the early 70s, he wrote a book called The Occult, or in the late 60s he wrote it, but it was published in early 70s. And this happened because, as I write about in my first book, Turn Off Your Mind, there was a cult revival in the 1960s that informed a great deal of the popular culture, from the music to comic books and TV shows and movies and so on and so on. And books about the occult became very, very popular. So he had always been interested in it, but he wasn't an occultist, and he was a philosopher and an existentialist and a novelist and all that. And he basically thought most of it was just rubbish. And he accepted the commission to write the book because he needed the money, frankly, he said. But then as he did the research, he became more and more convinced that actually there's much more to it than that. And so he more or less combined his earlier work on consciousness with these new insights into the paranormal and so on, and that informed the occult. And he continued to write. I mean, he died in 2013. I met him in 1983. I was living in New York at the time, and with a friend of mine, we went on a kind of mini search of the miraculous in Europe, just England, Amsterdam, England, Holland, and France. But part of the trip, I separated and went off on my own, and I hitchhiked from London down to Cornwall, the tail end, the furthest west of England, where Wilson lived since 1957, and stayed there for a day or two and talked to him about his writing and so on. I was a fanboy and all that, and we carried on a correspondence after that. And over the years, I met him many times. When he came to Los Angeles, and I was living there in the late 80s, he stayed with me, and I've interviewed him, quite a few times. I've reviewed some of his books. I've written introductions to some of his books. And so what I'm doing now is writing a book about his life and his ideas. And he's not as well known as he should be. Most people know The Outsider. This was the first book he did, and this was, I said, it was really very popular. And it was one of the books that people read, say, in the 50s into the early 60s. And then they probably know The Occult. That was the other one that was very, very big. But he developed a whole philosophy of consciousness. And in my books, I've taken, his approach and some of his ideas, and tried to link them up with other philosophers of consciousness, like Jean Gebser, who a different kettle of fish. Gebser was a Swiss German philosopher, but he also started out as a poet himself, and he had this very adventurous kind of life. In the sense, he had to leave Munich with the rise of the Nazis, and then he found himself down in Spain. But then the Spanish Civil War broke out, and he was almost shot by Franco's men at one point. And then he wound up going to Paris, and then he was in Paris when the Germans were coming later on. So in many ways, he was caught up in all the turbulence of the first half of the 20th century in Europe. But he had this revelation in Spain in the 30s about what he saw as this kind of transformation of consciousness taking place. And it first came to him through a study of the poetry of the Austrian poet Rilke. And through a variety of other things, he saw that there was this kind of shift in consciousness happening. And I talk about it in the book. And part of it is has to do with our different sense of time, how our understanding of time has started to become different, radically different, say in the beginning of the 20th century. And he references Einstein and then relativity, but then also the novels of, say, Joyce and Thomas Mann and Robert Musil and Proust and so on, and different music. I mean, if you ever get a chance to read The Ever-Present Origin, it's a hefty book. It's not, and he writes well, but it's very dense, a lot of material. But I just found it convincing because of the amount of material he was able to bring together from a variety of sources, from art, literature, philosophy, psychology, sociology, science, everything. So yeah, I mean, again, this is basically what I've become interested in over the years. The 40 years from when I first started reading this stuff till now is I'm I'm trying to understand it in terms of, we can say, the evolutionary history of consciousness.
You write as a historian, footnoting everything. It's innately more of a left brain enterprise what you do as an author, I would say, because of applying a timeline to history and causal connections and things like that, which is a little bit of a mildly ironic given the subject matter and given your assertion as well that it is, and stop me if I'm mischaracterizing it, but it is possible for there's a form of knowledge that is just as legitimate as left brain knowledge that that the right brain can arrive at. I'd love to hear more about what your right brain has arrived at or told you, like for.
Well, that's what I write about. That's what I'm saying.
It
isn't just the left brain working, then, because then it would be a really boring book,
Well, I mean, for example, just psychic phenomena. You seem to give it some credence.
Well, I mean, I'm myself. The most what do I say? Convincing have been various different precognitive dreams I've had over the years at different times. And then connected to those are also very, very otherwise inexplicable synchronicities, in C.G. Jung's term, meaningful coincidences that have been too spot on, as they say here, to just been purely by chance, and also a few telepathic experiences. But again, we tend to want these things to be these dramatic kind of X-File sort of things. And, if you pay attention to your experience, you notice them. I noticed I was having precognitive dreams because I read a book called An Experiment with Time by a fellow named J.W. Dunn that was written in the 1920s. And people like Colin Wilson had mentioned it. He was a friend of H.G. Wells. Other people knew him and so on. He wasn't an occultist. He was a aeronautic engineer, but he himself, by chance, just recognized that events that happened, during the day, or things he would come across, like newspaper headlines or such things like that, he realized he had dreamt them the night before, and so he started just to keep a record of his dreams, and then he would, notice daily events, and he said, if you did this, you would see the same thing. And so that's exactly what I did. And fairly soon after I started doing it, this was happening. Now, it wasn't like I didn't predict the winner, at Aqueduct or anything like that. It would be banal, trivial kinds of things that happen. But then you just notice that, oh my God, this is almost exactly what I dreamt last night or the night before. And on some occasions, they became so complex and connected to actually my everyday world, that it just seemed this just can't be coincidence. So I think I'm a fairly critical thinker. As you say, I'm left brain. I'm fairly rigorous, but I accept by extension the fact that these sorts of things happen in my own experience, and I'm as convinced of their reality as I am of the chair I'm sitting on and so on. Then I'm willing to accept that other things might be possible as well. But again, I think one, it's a good policy to go for the less dramatic explanation for things first, and if all else fails, then leave the door open for a paranormal sort of thing. And I don't go out of my way to look for them. I think that's a problem. I think if you do get them, and they can be a bother. You don't necessarily want these things happening all the time. I think there's a reason why we're not aware of them, and has to do with the evolution of consciousness. I think at an earlier time, we all were more telepathic. At an earlier time, there was more kind of far-seeing and that kind of thing. And it has to do with the much more relaxed and open, broader expansive sort of mode of consciousness that's associated with the right. But in order to basically get on, whatever you want to say is the force behind evolution. And I personally I'm not a Darwinian in the Richard Dawkins sense. I'm more of a Bergsonian. I do believe in a kind of life force, or elan vital, or whatever you want to call it. There's some purposive drive inherent in life. It isn't propelled only by mechanical, pressure from the environment and random mutations. So whatever you want to call it, that force behind life that has an urge to evolve figured out that it had to sort of somehow limit its consciousness in things. Otherwise, it's the same principle at work as when people take psychedelic drugs or any kind of inebriant or intoxicant. It works by relaxing the kind of let's get the work done attitude that the left brain, or whatever you want to call it, the dealing with mode of consciousness has.
The reducing valve is.
Yeah, it opens the reducing valve. Okay, that allows more stuff in, but then you're able to do less. That's the reason why they say don't drive, don't operate heavy machinery while under the influence of anything. I mean, it's not like, oh, we want to keep you from doing this, we nasty, oppressive people. No, it's actually there's a good reason, because you can't. Huxley himself said, he looked at a sink load of dishes, and they were too beautiful to wash. And that gives you an idea how Huxley was living at the time. But so there's a reason why we don't have. I know people who are psychic. They are more psychically sensitive, and it's a bother to them because in many ways they can't tell whether some feeling they're having is their own or something they're picking up, something that's just floating around, and they often feel oppressed by things that really they can't account for in their own life. And I think it has to do with their kind of filters are more permeable, or they're working on a wider bandwidth, or whatever the current metaphor would be to use. So I personally don't think the evolution of consciousness is towards developing those kind of psychic powers. I think you can notice them happening already if you pay attention to them. I think it has more to do with the kind of insight that comes when you have both sides working together, and which I hope happens in my writing, because yes, it is left brain, it's historical, it's philosophical, it's analytical, but I'm also talking about these other modes of consciousness, and I'm arguing against the kind of reductive, approach that's people like Dawkins and so many others. I think this is one of the reasons why I've always been interested in philosophy, and in the difficult philosophers like Hegel or Heidegger, is where they're trying to say something in a way that language just isn't built to say. They're trying to use prose, which is an explicit mode of communication, to convey these implicit sorts of meanings. Music is much better at it, but then you can't argue with music. There isn't the dialectic. And I think great philosophy and great philosophizing is when you discuss these ideas with people, when you just think on your own, you can approach those kinds of spheres of immediate meaning that music has, and this, and this is why music in many ways has always been kind of an affirmative symbol for some philosophers. It says yes. It just says yes, and and it's the kind of yes that you don't have to argue. You don't have to give reasons for. It's just kind of yesness.
I would pay anything to hear Nietzsche's piano compositions.
Well, they apparently weren't that good, but
I don't believe that.
There must be a recording of them somewhere. I would think there must be somewhere. But yeah, I don't know.
Well, actually, I don't think he wrote them down. I think he improvised.
All right. Okay. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I'd like to hear just a little. In a way, there's almost sort of nothing to say about music unless we're trying to just analyze and overanalyze, as I will do on this show.
I agree with you.
But could you share a little bit about your relationship with it? You told me earlier that you have listened to classical since the 80s.
Yeah. Well, what happened? I mean, obviously I was, I was in rock and roll. I mean, I really wasn't a musician. I mean, I was in the right place at the right time to get into Blondie and the whole sort of CBGB scene. I was living in New York and I was writing poetry, but I could, I had jammed in, some bands before and could kind of play the bass, and then I got invited to do that. And it was at the time when more energy and attitude was wanted than kind of expertise, and as we know, the mid 70s rock had turned into kind of Wagnerian excess bands like Yes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer and all that, and you had to go to the Juilliard School of Music in order to play rock and roll. But I mean, I somehow transferred writing poetry, which pretty much all of it was bad, and into writing songs. And that came from growing up and during the 60s when I had the radio on all the time, and you just heard all these great songs one after the other. I mean, I'm really a child from that time. I mean, I was a kid. I wasn't a hippie. I wasn't like part of the 60s scene, but I was a kid growing up, and the Beatles were on, and the British Invasion, and then Motown, and then the San Francisco Sound, and then this was a period when there was just a lot of great songs, very melodic music, recognizable, hummable tunes. And that's what started to come back when I was first playing, So that somehow, and again, that's the fun in itself in terms of history of music. That's very interesting because it was only about 10 years. I mean, the New York thing started up in '74, really. I mean, I could depend how far back you want to go, but even still, by the early '70s, there was this kind of sense of getting back to rock's roots, precisely because of what I was talking about. So you have this nostalgia ready for, the '50s. And then what was happening in New York, you had a lot of influence from, say, the 60s, and people were doing homages, to these great early 60s groups and bands when it was like short songs and cool guitar riffs, very recognizable, sort of, good pop, good rock. And I just, I was able to, turn the poetry into, writing the songs and playing guitar and playing bass and so on and so on. And I played Blondie a couple of years, and I had my own band for a couple of years. We did some recording. It was called The No. The name came from my interest in Gnosticism. I mean, but
yeah, the KNOW, right?
Yeah, KNOW. Yeah, and at the time, as I said, I had started to become interested in all the sort of thing I write about now. And so, I mean, the song that was a hit here, I'm always touched by your presence, dear, Blondie. That's about this telepathic communication I was having with my girlfriend at the time. We were sharing dreams, and we knew what each other was thinking, and so on and so on. That sort of thing that does happen between couples.
When we play at cards, you use an extra sense. It's really not cheating. You can read my head, I've got no defense. When you send your messages, whispered loud and clear.
And so even then, my interests were informing, songs I was writing. But then after, and the last person I played with Iggy Pop for a year, basically writing shotgun as a guitarist for 2 tours. And that was like these sex, drugs, and rock and roll tours for me. And I just kind of got tired of it after that. But what had happened is that a different girlfriend, another girlfriend I had in New York at the time, she was a model. This must have been about 1980. And she came back from Japan with this weird little contraption with headphones, and it was a Walkman. And she was one of the first people in New York to have a Walkman. At least nobody else I knew had one, and I didn't see anybody else on the street with them. And so she let me use it, and I had just started. Actually, there's a novel by Colin Wilson called The Philosopher's Stone that has to do with these different experiments with the brain that lead to developing this kind of mystical consciousness. And part of it, the 2 characters, in order to sort of test their ability to stay focused and concentrated, they go through listening to these long symphonies, one after the other. And so I wanted to be like them, so I just decided to go and start doing this myself. And there used to be, I don't know if it's still there, but there was a Barnes & Noble. It was the only one on Fifth Avenue. And they had this cheap, discount cassette bin. And I used to just pick out these classical cassettes and just put them in. I mean, I heard some classical music. I had no training in it. I didn't have it in my family when I was growing up, but I heard some on in some films, Stanley Kubrick movies and things like that. But I just walked around New York with that on, and suddenly everything's a soundtrack, and suddenly everything's a movie. And one of the things I used to do was go down to the old piers, by the Hudson, because when you're a rock and roll, you do have some afternoons to yourself. And I just would listen to some symphony by Mahler and just watch these, occasionally you see a boat coming down, a ship coming down, and everything looked like the beginning of a film. So it just seemed much bigger and dramatic and more expansive, and to cover much more material than the kind of music I was doing. And it kind of killed me for rock. I just couldn't write songs anymore. And I just started listening to that. And then I just dropped out of, by 82, I was out of the rock world and trying to find my feet, eventually wound up, becoming a writer 10 years later, a little bit more than 10 years later. But that was it. So I just started listening to some of these incredible compositions, and I was most impressed by these long symphonies by late romantics like Mahler and Bruckner and Sibelius, and they're just whole worlds. They're just whole worlds, cosmos within the music. And I mean, I don't know and understand it technically at all. I mean, my sons play violin, and I can't read music, and I can't talk to them in the way that they understand it, as you said before, analyzing it, all that. But I certainly feel it, and I'm certainly, I know these pieces I know, very well, and there's quite nothing like it these days for me. If I'm in the right mood to hear, a certain passage from Beethoven or Mozart or whatever, and you're just sort of transformed. So I would say that yes, to me, the kind of immediate, direct sort of meaning and significance that comes through this kind of great music is, to me, the closest thing to sorts of mystical experiences I've had.
I've come away from your work with the feeling that the right brain is a bit helpless, and that we meaning our left hemisphere selves, have to be generous stewards of our right brain, and in the parlance, create safe spaces for it, both in our individual days, in the schedule of our days, in the material that we imbibe, even culturally, by maintaining places that don't make sense, like comedy clubs and rock clubs.
Or just peace and quiet.
Yeah, that's a novel.
The hardest.
That's a novel idea.
Yeah.
Actually, yeah.
I was going to say the most costly things now are the absence of something. To have no sound, no movement around you, to have space, empty space. It's something that costs a lot now. But no, I agree. I think that's because the right brain basically just is. It kind of endures. And as you say, we, because according to split brain theory, our sense of I lives in the left brain. Our ego, our verbal ego, the part of the self that uses words and language, inhabits the left brain. So we, literally, I talking to you now, am my left brain, and with any luck, my right is informing what I'm saying by giving me intuitions, inspiration. Oh, that's an interesting thing. That kind of, when you said, let's see what happens as we talk. Well, a good talk is when, you get excited about the ideas and the intuitions, the meanings, the significance, why it's interesting, why it's important. That feeling comes to you, and then the left brain can articulate it. And that's the relationship, I would say, between, with writing as well. That's how I feel my job is to get these. I have these sort of intuitions about something, a hunch. I see a connection. Something seems important, and to try to articulate it, to use the words, the tools of the left brain to open it up, to unpack it. I mean, that should be the real relationship between the two. The right presents this kind of large, felt kind of significance. And then the left says, what exactly is that? How can I best express that? If I want to tell someone, if I want to share that with somebody, how can I convey that? and the tools I have to do that are words. Other people, painters paint, musicians compose, and dancers dance, and so on. But the language is of all of those languages, the most specifically left brain. And so, yes, we have to realize that it's for our own good, both individual left brain's good, and also the good of both of us, basically, to understand the importance of this other mode of consciousness. And again, to recognize that it's there already. We already experience it. It's not something strange and distant and alien that we have to go hunt for and find. We already experience it all the time. And if you were completely left-brained, you would be something much more like the cliched ideas of androids or something like that, or a hyper Mr. Spock. Everything is just factual and logical and all that. But none of us are really like that. Or maybe Richard Dawkins is. I don't know. But none of us is. We all still have that other side of us. We just don't. We don't recognize it clearly. We don't sort of have a felt sense of its being part of us. And again, I think that's something else that's important too, is to recognize that this stuff is happening all the time. It's there. I mean, the most important job for us is to try to understand exactly what it means to be us. That sounds rather banal and like a platitude, but again, we get back to that question of and see, the left brain asks the question. The right brain kind of knows who it is, but it's like when St. Augustine said, time. If you don't ask me what it is, I know the answer to the question. So the right brain kind of knows in some inarticulate, immediate sense that it is and all that. The left asks that question, and it's the kind of interplay between the two. The left doing its best to articulate the implied, I don't want to say ineffable, because it isn't ineffable, then it means you just give up. But you know what I mean? It's just difficult to say, but that's how it works,
It may be a logarithmic approach sort of thing where you never can articulate anything perfectly.
Yeah, exactly. Again, that's it. Yeah. I mean, or the things
anything beyond mathematics, perhaps.
Yeah. Again, the things you can articulate perfectly are fundamentally, trivial. They're not the really, really important things. But the problem with some schools of philosophy, like logical positivism and other kinds, who say like, well, if you can't say it, then it's not important. So this is just that they wanted to be able to pin things down explicitly.
You're more in the continental school.
Yeah, I definitely would say.
Sure.
I definitely would say, and in my own way. I mean, I'm trying to write popular books, so I'm not setting myself as some kind of traditional academic philosopher, but I do write about philosophy and philosophers, and these are two things. I mean, back in the 80s, after I left music and basically just sort of didn't do anything for a couple of years, I wound up going back to university, and I studied philosophy, and I got a degree in philosophy. But at the same time I was doing that, I was working at this sort of preeminent metaphysical bookshop in California at the time, a place called the Bodhi Tree Bookstore, which was in Hollywood, Los Angeles. And so I was, studying philosophy by day, and then I worked the night shift at the bookshop, and talking to people about their chakras and tarot cards and astral bodies in the evening. So it was, in that sense, I was living out this kind of two sides world already. And the kind of philosophy that interests me is the kind that asks the same kind of questions that the esoteric tradition asks. And the aspects of the esoteric tradition that interest me are the ones that have the kind of rigor, the intellectual and critical rigor that philosophy has. So people I've written about are people to me who have that to some degree. People like Rudolph Steiner, people like P.D. Uspensky, Gebser, and others. They're open to these broader questions and these broader experiences of life, but they bring a real kind of clarity and intellectual integrity to it. And so again, this is something you don't get in a great deal of this sort of stuff. You get sort of, very sloppy, sentimental New Age thinking, or rather, or I don't know, people take ayahuasca and that's the answer to everything, or something like that. So, I'm nothing against that, but it's just I'm trying to do something different.
Well, thank you, Mr. Lachman, for joining us.
My pleasure. My pleasure. I hope it was enjoyable for you.
It was, and informative for everybody. His new book is The Secret Teachers of the Western World, Gary Lachman.